cohort of Snapshot users. So we're really excited to have this forum today, which will really be quite an open discussion and an opportunity to really ask questions around Snapshot, around Snapshot's data, around where it's going and what we can do to support all the users out there. I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the land in which I live, work and play, and acknowledge that their country was never ceded, and extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And really take note that the approach of caring for country and understanding country is fundamental to understanding and learning our way out of the current climate crisis. Some really simple housekeeping. It's really helpful for us to see your faces. It will enable us to answer your questions and understand the responses to this webinar a whole lot better. And it is being recorded, and if you can mute yourselves unless you're asking questions, that would be really helpful. So this is a Snapshot data webinar. I'm assuming most of you have been to the previous webinar, but I will recap some of the information just really briefly, just to bring everyone up to speed and for those people who missed the initial one. Snapshot's been around for a couple of years now, developed by BZE and I at Bark Sustainability with the support of lots and lots of different resources and funding organisations and others who have helped us with data contributions or review. It wouldn't be there without that support and that collaborative model behind it. So we really, really appreciate everyone's contributions. We also really, really appreciate the support of the Victorian Government and DELP, who have enabled this particular upgrade to happen with new features, which include new data, so the 2020 and 2021 financial years and calendar years, the introduction of a time series so that you can start to understand emissions and their changes over time, and the addition of subsectors so that you can actually get the breakdown of each different sector, which includes stationary energy, agriculture, waste, transport, and now including the industrial product processes and product use as well. And we also have subsector time series, which will start to become really interesting as particularly the energy sector really reduces emissions quite dramatically over the next 10 years. We've had some really lovely feedback from all of our users, and it's pretty obvious that Snapshot is becoming quite critical to people developing their climate action strategies and actions, and also becoming critical to people understanding how those are working, so that the continued support of Snapshot is really important for both councils and communities and other users as well. Now, one of the problems around Snapshot is that the data source is changing because we can get access to different data over time. And this means that profiles change when we get that new information. But according to all of our users, you really definitely want that information included. So just to provide some context, this means that some of the profiles will change. So these are all 2019 profiles for Darebin, but using the different data that we've had accessible over each 2020, 2021 and 2022 update. The total number changes slightly, and the addition of new sectors like IPPU also change that. But we understand that can be a bit problematic for communicating with your communities, but there is a user guide on our website that will help explain all those processes and enable you to explain those differences to your communities. This was also mentioned briefly, the data source. So this is something that I imagine will come up quite a lot today, is around tier 1 and tier 2 data. So we are introducing more and more tier 2 data when it's available. Those are the bits that are highlighted in yellow. And as a quick definition of tier 1 and tier 2 data, tier 1 data is generally state-based information that we model down to the local government or electorate scale. whereas tier 2 data is data like the Google Environmental Insights data, which tracks people's phones to see if they're moving in and out of your council. So the localized tier 2 data is often more accurate, but not always. But using that localized information will help with understanding the data in your community. So we are working towards providing more tier 2 data when we can. For example, the agricultural sector is now using all tier 2 data across all states and territories, which is quite a step up. And Matt and Rich can explain a little bit more about that later as well. And we have just put together this kind of tool to demonstrate the proportion of tier 1 and tier 2 data for each snapshot. So this is not currently available on the website, but it is something we could work towards using if it's of use to people. And also, just for comparison, this shows the proportion of tier 1 and tier 2 data across the 3 biggest states in Australia. So the darker the blue colour here, the more tier 2 data is represented in that LGA. So Queensland is actually the state that has got the most tier 2 data in the snapshot profiles. And then in New South Wales, it's dependent on which council you're looking at, but there's probably a slightly higher proportion of councils in New South Wales that have tier 2 data, and in Victoria it's slightly less. And this is primarily due to the lack of accessible DNSP data in Victoria. The methodology updates will be published online in a few weeks, and all of the nitty-gritty data information will be online shortly. So you can always use this as a reference guide to understand the data sources and how we have come up with the emissions profiles. And we'll let you know when they're up there. Now I'm going to hand over to Matt and Rich. We have prepared a few slides just to answer questions that we got before this webinar when you registered. So we'll go through those and then we'll open it up for discussion and everyone can have a chance to hit us with your hardest questions. Take it away, Matt and Rich.
Sure, I'm happy to go through it. So yeah, thanks, Imogen. So these were just some of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. So we'll run through these and then afterwards we should have plenty of time for some additional questions. So in most instances, I've just sort of paraphrased the questions, or there's a few similar ones, so they might be combined. But yeah, we'll just run through some of them now. So there are a few around whether or not we're going to look at postcode level profiles. So currently we obviously have LGAs, federal electorates and states. And yeah, certainly postcodes are something that we can do in the future and stuff. I guess it's all about sort of gauging interest, but the fact that there are at least a couple were interested in postcodes was good to hear. But yeah, we'd certainly like to hear from people whether or not that is something that would be helpful for them. So the next one, so Snapshot currently excludes residential wood burning emissions. Will effort be made to fill this void in the future? So this is certainly a question that's come up previously. And I guess in a lot of sort of instances around including sort of additional things, a lot of the time it comes around, it's all around like limitations around the data. So what sort of data is accessible? And I guess for it to be sort of GPC compliant, we sort of need the data to be sort of complete as well. And from what I've heard from Matt and stuff is that, yeah, CSIRO have actually published a new method based on ABS data, which is great. So it just means this data is freely accessible and something that we would be able to replicate. So yeah, certainly stay tuned for more information around including this in Snapshot. Do you want to go to the next one, Imogen?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to... Doesn't seem to be skipping for me. Oh, there you go.
So how are industrial processes and energy consumption differentiated based on the safeguard mechanism data? So this is certainly something that is done. But so currently the safeguard mechanism, we just have, I guess, total emissions. So it's not sort of from safeguard, it's not broken down by energy consumption and industrial processes. So this is something that we do internally, just using, I guess, an apportionment sort of method. And this is just based on the AGIS emissions by state and sector. And so we're hoping to update the methodology before the end of this year. So if you are interested in more information, please check out this when it's uploaded to the website. So did we miss one there, Imogen, or this is the...
Oh. We skip the aviation one?
Yeah, cool. How do the boundaries of aviation emissions work? So this is certainly that's come up a few times previously. So data is limited to domestic travel only. So overseas travel is not... sorry, Imogen, do you want to go back? Yeah, so overseas travel is excluded. And so what we're looking at is total persons kilometers traveled. And so that's obviously split between, I guess, the origin and destination for each pairs of airport. And so emissions are sort of allocated to the municipality of the airport rather than, I guess, the where the person traveling sort of originates from, because that data simply wouldn't be sort of accessible. So it's just, really around domestic travel and where the airport is located. Trends in electrification available. So yeah, something that's certainly important, but it's really outside of the scope of our Snapshot currently. And although data's, I guess, always improving, sometimes, it's sort of unavailable for certain things that we're interested in, and that's could be due to privacy or cost or other factors as well. But certainly feel free to get in touch with us if you have any interest in sort of exploring this further. How much does the tool cost for a typical metropolitan council? I understand that's what the question was, but obviously the tool is free, and it's going to stay that way for Snapshot.
And one of the reasons the tool is free is because we have some sponsorship support from wonderful councils around the country. So we really appreciate their enabling Snapshot for everyone, which is one of the sort of defining principles around Snapshot, is that we understand that many councils and communities cannot get access to this information without tools like this, and we really want to keep it available and supportive to all players in this space. That's the end of the pre-prepared questions. So now it's open to you to put any questions you've got in the chat, or put your hand up and we'll come to you to answer them. We've got a fair bit of time, so really open to getting into some detail if you've got interesting questions. Okay, Stephen.
Cool, I'll jump in first. That's great, thanks IMBARC team and everyone. So pleased to see the tool, the update to the tool come to fruition, and so much interest from the session last week and this one again. My question was just around the sort of map that you had up in an earlier slide, Imogen, the LGAs, and whether that could be an avenue to interact with the tool at some stage as well, rather than putting in your LGA or your postcode or your federal electorate. If there could be a sort of more graphical interface to kind of click on a defined LGA and come up with a profile that way. Just because I don't sort of know the names of every bit of the country that I'm interested in the emissions of, for example.
Well, I could answer that. So that's absolutely something that is on the list of things that we're keen to look at. So the way that people can use it and creating really, really intuitive use cases, graphical interfaces can be more accessible. And so, yeah, we're really interested in trying that. And also it does open the possibility to doing things such as creating regions to look at for emissions and the like. So, so yeah, what we'll do, like for things like this, where they're functionality tweaks and it's like interface tweaks and user experience, like it would be great to sort of get feedback from people about what their like what seems like most useful, most valuable to it, and then we can work out a program for how to bring that online. Yeah.
There's another couple in the chat. So one around methane and other greenhouse gases calculated on a 40-time horizon from Dorothy.
So just in regards to methane calculations, so we use calculations compliant or just consistent with the methane emission coefficients used in the national greenhouse account factors. So they just, in the latest update, they did have an update to the factors that they were using, and so we've adopted those adjustments. But yeah, we intend to stay consistent with the national greenhouse account factors for that. So if there's, I mean, there's obviously a lot of different ways that you can take that. So yeah.
And there's also a question from Ben around measuring sequestration in Scope 3.
Okay, so sequestration. So I guess broadly we could classify sequestration as two main areas. So one is like vegetation-based sequestration, so land use change and potentially agricultural products as well. And the second is like, I guess, CCS or other sort of mechanical style sequestrations or like sort of non-vegetation based sequestrations. We don't have any non-vegetation based sequestration in the platform at the moment. We do have land use change, so the change in vegetation and the carbon associated with that. But we're actually in a process of developing a revised method for that. That will be using direct satellite data. So we're testing that method out now, but it's looking extremely robust. I was actually just working on it yesterday. And so we'll be experimenting over the next few months. We'll be experimenting with the implications of that satellite-based imagery and that categorization of land use change, which should give better granularity around land use change variation than some of the other methods we've had to date. Okay, so when you include residential wood burning, will black carbon be included? Yeah, we'll probably include black carbon. It's pretty straightforward as an additional metric. So there's, so it's fairly straightforward. It will be the first big three gas for GWP. With the exclusion of refrigerants. So we've brought refrigerants on now, and so they're largely not big three. So so that's included. So yeah, carbon black probably will include that, but like it's a C2E function. So we currently don't have gas breakouts in Snapshot in the data reporting, but that also could be, again, exploring functionality. That could be something that could be brought on. Is there local uptake data that you can use to complement emissions data? All right, so we do incorporate uptake of certain, it's like solar PV basically. So embedded solar PV is incorporated into the identification of, so where we don't have tier 2 data for electricity consumption, so where it's not directly measured, we do use solar uptake and relative solar uptake as an element that contributes to the attribution of electricity consumption to municipalities. So it is taken into account in that way. We're also, as you would know, most embedded solar is behind the meter, and so therefore you really only have visibility around export quantities. but in some of the tier 2 data sets that we've got accessible, solar PV export is like a subset of data that's available. So we can look to bring that on as well, as a function. Like that's, yeah, but the way that it interacts with the grid and the way it interacts with the way that like electricity emissions coefficients work is like a little complex. So they're typically not geospatially distributed, which would be necessary to reflect that impact directly, but there would be ways of representing that.
Hey, Matt, I might interrupt you and go to Mitch, who's got his hand up.
Oh, sure, please.
And then we'll come back to the chat.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, beauty. I'm just wondering, so we're part of GCOM and do CDP reporting, and they tell me that the Science Based Targets Network are updating their methodology, and CDP are kind of reviewing their entire framework. They tell me that they're trying to reach out and work with you guys to, you know, make that easier for everyone. Is that something that you guys are doing, kind of establishing Snapshot to be able to fit into their reporting framework?
Would you like me to answer? Because yes, absolutely it is. Yeah, so we're very interested in CDP. We're currently liaising with them about the standards or the method that we use for establishing science-derived targets for municipalities. That's one of the points of engagement. We already have Snapshot's one of the few platforms globally that has a direct upload to their backend, and we are talking with them about how to improve and streamline integration going forward. So yeah, that's absolutely something we're looking on. But also at the same time, we're really interested in knowing, like, from a local government, from an Australian perspective, because Snapshot being an Australian-focused platform, like, you know, where the value is for Australian councils in this, and how to make it, you know, as effective and as useful for them as possible. So, although, yeah, CDP is a partner and like someone we're working with, but our the people we care about are Australian local government.
And I might throw to Lex as well to talk a bit more about the Science-Derived Targets Working Group and the information that's available there, and potential information as well.
Thanks, Imogen. Sorry, I've got a lot of feedback here. Let's try this one. Can you hear me now without feedback? I hope so. Matt's spot on. And yeah, if anyone's interested, you can actually, I'm just going to put the link in here. We've been working for about, 6 or 7 years now with a lot of the other like key city networks around Australia to make sure that the approach and the methodology towards developing science-derived targets and carbon budgets consistent. Because if you don't have a consistent methodology, it means that, you know, the whole budget of different councils doesn't equal the whole of what's happening in Australia. And now, as Matt said, over the last few years, what we've been trying to do is make sure that that's a recognised methodology for the broader SBTI, which is the Science-Based Targets initiative. And I think we're very well down that track. And the idea is a little bit like Snapshot in my mind, to make sure that we can get this information out as quickly and easily, because we don't want to spend time with councils or community groups trying to, you know, understand and really get into the detail of how you actually develop these things when we've kind of done that work. So we can say, right, here's your snapshot profile, and here is your science-derived targets and carbon budget. And yes, Mitch, ideally, click here and it'll get filled. But that's one of the things the team here have got on their list. There's a lot of these discussions that go on behind the scenes over the last few years with the likes of CDP, ICLEI, GCOM, C40 even, to make sure that it aligns with those organisations and structures. Thanks.
We almost have that work sitting there ready to go. It just hasn't been a priority project, and we probably need someone to come to the table to give us a little bucket of money to make that a priority project and turn it into reality.
Mitch, you can give us 100 grand.
Like that's a good
Jump change.
Good sales pitch. So we've got Dorothy Robertson has a hand, I think,
Yeah, no, what I wanted to ask was a little bit more clarification over the time horizons for your inventory emissions, because at the moment the IPCC calculates 20-year time horizons and 100-year time horizons. And the 20-year time horizons are important because that's the critical period by which we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees and possibly even 2 degrees if we're very, very unlucky. So we need to address the short-term climate issues and the climate emergency, as well as look at 100 years, because we don't have 100 years to solve the problem. So, and basically we have to do both, otherwise we won't solve the problem and we'll pass climate tipping points. So I was just wondering how you are handling that, because I think originally you said you based all your short-lived climate pollutants on 40 years. And is that still 40 years, or are you thinking of changing it?
So the point that you raised is an interesting one. Moving between, as you outline, the time frame is has different implications. Your methane impacts go up, your NO2 impacts go down. So the implications are, there's different implications you draw from different timelines. One of the considerations I think that we have here is that Snapshot is not designed to be everything for all people. It's designed to be something that is accessible and understandable. And I find moving between timelines is actually one of the things that erodes understanding with stakeholders because it's quite a complex matter to get people's heads around. So we are interested in playing around with that and looking at that. And we're actually looking to bring on some tools that move in parallel to Snapshot that could be that could just give some flexibility and some opportunity to explore some of these alternate scenario, alternate parameter messaging. But I guess also there's a desire for consistency as well. So I think if it's the case, and always we come down to use case, like how it's being used and what's the most effective way to design a solution to be used in that manner. So happy to sort of continue to explore that. I guess what we'd do is we'd say would the implications be different? Would we say the recommendations or the understanding be different if drawn out from different, in applying these factors different ways? And if so, how would we want to shape that dialogue?
Yeah, was I right though that it is 40 years for SLCP, or did I misunderstand that from the
I'll have to check with
yeah.
team, but I think it is. Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. But certainly, I mean, I believe the implications will be different depending on the timeline, because roughly half of the warming is from short-lived climate pollutants. But thanks very much. That's helpful, very helpful.
We might throw to Stephen and then go back to the questions in the chat.
Yeah, it was just a quick follow-up on the CDP reporting, just to flag it. It's one of the things that we discussed with the Snapshot team when looking at, what kind of updates to progress with the funding that Victorian government was able to bring to the table. But based on that feedback, especially from the sort of Australian local government review and from conversations with sort of stakeholders in Victoria, greenhouse alliances and local councils, we thought it was a really good idea to target this round of improvements on the sort of, accuracy, quality, sort of granular detail of the data, but certainly recognise that reporting to platforms like CDP or sort of other platforms, it's really important, but it can also be a little bit kind of finicky and burdensome. Victorian government also reports to CDP, and it's quite a time-consuming exercise. So yeah, certainly something that that might be a good thing to look to in future. And not something that's kind of a new idea, just to add that to the mix.
Yeah, I could answer a couple of these quickly. So electricity emissions does combine scope 2 and 3. Interestingly, scopes actually, where they originate from corporate definitions of carbon emissions, and they actually don't really make that much sense when it applies to municipalities. You can sort of, there's like some analogs, but there's issues around boundaries and stuff like that. But anyway, so yes, it does include scopes 2 and 3. That question, Wendy, that you asked about how councils conveying to the general public the trends, that is actually this whole big conversation, which would be really great to sort of set as part of an ongoing dialogue, which is like basically the interpretation of change over time and like how should that be done and what tools do you need to do it effectively. So I will park that temporarily. You actually also asked another question, which is around empirical appliance, PV size installation data, EV car ownership, those kind of things. So this is super cool. This is moving into activity data. So it's moving away from the holistic picture of emissions and it's moving towards how do you actually track the specific types of initiatives, specific, sub-trends and things occurring with your municipality. We're actually in the process right now of building tool sets that allow for that activity data exploration, the things that drive the emissions and the emissions trends. So there's like, and this is really where you start to get into an environment where you can actually realistically go like, okay, let's try and understand what's happening. Let's try and anticipate what's going to happen. So we're, yeah, it's something we're exploring, and we're exploring it through the EI in action projects and through sort of dashboards that display these trends. They're all in trial at the moment.
I think there's one from Carmel around waste.
Yeah. Council said 2 minutes. So tracking, so Snapshot in general is not good for tracking waste, like from a corporate perspective for councils. Like councils will have access to more accurate data. We are looking to have it so that locally provided data for waste may be something that potentially can plug in to Snapshot. It's a pretty messy data set in general. Like there's often a lack of standardization about how it's documented. Like the Victorian State Government actually has a reasonably nice data set that collects municipal waste collection that is quite valuable and is integrated into the back end for Victoria. That sort of gets waste data at the municipal level, but that's municipal waste. So waste that goes to landfill is, that's only part of that waste stream. And also like there can be like the treatment, which is really one of the most significant factors influencing waste conversion, is there's a lack of standardization about how to determine deemed future treatment coefficients for waste streams going into landfills with treatment facilities. So there is an opportunity to sort of sharpen up how that works. And like, yeah, quite interested in exploring that and sort of continuing to iterate that.
There's another one from Nick. Do you want to ask that one, Nick, or I'm happy to, do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, certainly. And just wondered, this is a fair way away from what we've been discussing, but I just wondered if you guys at Ironbark had actually thought about doing something similar to Snapshot for consumption-based emissions profiles. We're coming across stuff from C40 and some other international organizations that are that's putting more emphasis on consumption-based profiles as a way of helping cities to have more of an influence over the emissions associated with what they consume, not just what passes through their municipality. Just sort of, I wondered if you had any plans to investigate that. It's another sphere of reporting, I know, but yeah, just curious.
So yeah, so consumption-based emissions reporting is a really interesting area. We've done some trial explorations of that for a couple of councils around Australia already. One of the issues that we have is that Australia has currently relatively low quality documentation of upstream production and emission sources, which means that although there are a few different systems out there, they lack the, I guess, the robustness and the granularity that would sort of connect through to genuine insights being connected to that sort of information. That being said, I do agree with you. I think it is actually a really worthwhile thing to be exploring. I would say it's probably something that would need to be solved like sort of sector by sector, or like sort of consumption stream by consumption stream, rather than trying to do it holistically. Like if there were certain sectors that we could focus on and get the full upstream emissions intensity, like high contact areas, like for instance, ones where have relatively low complex supply chains, like for instance, meat would be good to target. And so we did some work around that. Our indications are that it's likely we'll be able to get some clarity on a stream like that. So so yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting area, and we are happy to explore it. And we have done some exploration today on that.
I think the next one would go back to Carmel, and using comparisons of snapshot and targets.
That was okay. Council set a target in 2005 using population emissions. What will be updated? So that means they set a target in 2005, or
no? I guess the target we've set is to reduce by 75% on 2005 levels.
Oh, from a baseline of 2005.
Yeah. And so our community is like, oh well, this new data is showing different numbers from last year and the year before. So are you changing the original target?
Oh, sure. Okay, so so like that's a good question. I think like what I'll do is I'll answer like when the numbers change year on year for the same year. So so the emissions reported for 2018 last year has changed for this year. So in instances where we've done that, it's where we've got either better data sets or we've identified an improvement to a method or some other sharpening, which means like that, as far as we understand it, the emissions for 2018 for the new approach are an improved representation of 2018 emissions. And we can always go in, we're very happy to improve comms, we can go into like specifics around that. So like what it would mean is like that if you're doing a comparison from a 2005 to like a current, like a ratio, then the better scenario would be that your 2005 emissions will be prepared in a similar manner to the say the current emissions. So that's for most of the methods that we employ, that should be possible, right? So like it should be like all the data sets that we're using are typically consistent and go back quite some distance in time. In fact, one of the functions we're talking about is potentially doing quite deep, like quite far into the past historical records for municipalities, just extending beyond when Snapshot came online and going back much further. So we could, so in those instances that would then apply. If you did, if you compared it with an inventory that was just using different methods, then yeah, you could, it could have any relationship. It could be make it much easier or much harder. It would not be it would not be representative of actual change necessarily. So I'd say like you can definitely do it, but I would recommend like looking to apply a similar method for preparing a 2005 inventory to the current records, and probably that should be quite reasonable, quite achievable, because the data required to do so should be available.
Okay, and so could we, because we had asked you guys about how we should get it and we didn't get that type of feedback, so can we can pay for you guys to do that for us, so we might update it so it's actually easier for us to compare, possibly?
Yes, if that's what yes, that's right. Yeah, so so because like I do recall that request, Carmel. So because like we don't currently sit on the extension, so that means we couldn't have just given it to you just off the bat. But yes, so that is something that in general that we can be paid for, or like we are, if again, one of those functionality things of just extending that into the past is something we potentially will be able to bring online in the next 12 months or so. So, but yes, very happy to have that conversation.
Lex, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Imogen, and thanks, Matt. Carmel, it's an interesting question, and I think I was just looking through some previous, like there's been a bit of a journey when it comes to Snapshot and profiles and the value of them, and when it comes to community profiles or inventories, just in general, even it's a journey that goes back more than the 4 or 5 years of Snapshot, but 20 years to when there were emissions profiles or inventories or baselines that were developed in 2005 and in 98 and 99. And one of the big challenges, of course, is that they are really they've got, a lot of them have really poor quality data. And so one of the things that we were really clear on in, a lot of the earlier Narrative and communications around Snapshot was to make sure that you decouple your emissions profile, or the inventories, as some people inaccurately called them, including ourselves 15 years ago, or myself when I worked at ICLEI. We would say you've got your inventory, you've got your baseline, but we just had so many doubts about the data that we probably weren't upfront or as clear about that. So we've been trying to be really clear over the last 4 or 5 years that these profiles, and I would caution as well, any profile that has been developed through other organizations or other people or whatever it was, there are clear limitations that we've had in the past. And so the journey that we've been on is to make sure that any data that we get improves and benefits all 537 councils. So we've got that lens over everyone. And so we've always said, decouple your profiles from your targets. However, I think we've kind of come to a point, and Matt, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. In the last 6 to 8 months, even as we get more of the tier 2 data, that we can start to revisit that conversation. So in the past, we said, just wait. We'll get there. It's not an inventory, it's not a baseline, but it's going to get better. And now we're at the stage where we've put in a hell of a lot of hard work to say, yeah, you know what, we can actually start looking at this and measuring and trends. I think that's one of the big things for the next few years. I appreciate it's a really challenging communications piece though, because that's something that was hard for us 4 or 5 years ago to talk to councils about, let alone then when we are talking to councillors or community groups who'll just say, why hasn't that changed from 2005? Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I agree with where Lex is going with that conversation. Like, I think where we've got to is where some of the data sets are being collected with enough robustness, repeatability, and the like. So that means parts of the activity that produces your emissions can now be sort of used for trending towards targets. And as we get more complete on the measurement of the total municipal inventory, and we continue to improve those data pathways, then that will expand. And yeah, with the goal that ideally that by having that really robustly, comprehensive data set across the municipality, that means that overall trending can then be done. But as I said, like that whole trending thing, which I know is like a real focus these days, we're currently doing a lot of trials to like how to do that effectively, how to do things like adjust for noise and uncertainty and BAU trends and things like that. And so like that's like I think a really interesting area. It's going to be a huge development area for like interesting new tools and new functions that will allow all of you to do this more effectively and communicate more effectively.
Yeah, it's loud and clear that we want to change this. Here is our slide from 2017 when we were saying just hold tight. A lot's going to change. It's going to be a bit messy, but we're getting to the stage now where we're looking like we can overcome some of these challenges, because there is, I stress this, an extraordinary amount of work that goes on behind the scenes for these things to make sure that what we've got, we can, stand behind hand on heart and say, yeah, it's not quite there yet, or this area is a challenge, to we're now in a situation where we can start really looking at using this for these purposes.
Could I answer Jana's question now? Does that suit everyone for the EIE transport? Yeah. So the question is just looking to the comparison between EIE transport emissions versus calculating transport emissions from state government travel and activity surveys. So the I would say that they both present different strengths and weaknesses. And myself looking at the data, I feel that the EIE data is stronger for the particular things of interest to local government. So generally, like when we look to develop data sets, what we do is we look for like anchoring data, so data that has like this really good localized granular breakdowns. And then we can look to other data sets that can influence or suggest patterns within that anchoring data. And so the EIE data forms a good anchoring data because it's quite numerical, it's activity based, it's tracked to individual movements of vehicles, and it's very comprehensive. That's one of the things that we really like about it, is that we know it encapsulates all of the travel of those types in those particular municipalities. And then we can apply survey type insights into like, the purpose of trips and like sort of the other considerations that could influence the breakdowns of those vehicle movements. So so I think that the EIE data set provides an improved comprehensive allocation of emissions. We are currently working with the Victorian State Government in particular to just tweak and sort of further explore the relationships between how emissions are determined by the different other means. You might be surprised or not surprised, but transport emissions in particular, like different variations in methods can produce very, very different results for certain geographical areas, depending on how you establish boundaries and allocate. And so that means doing comparisons to different methods requires some work as well to sort of to understand like how that comparison should be made. But we are working on that.
I'll just add a few things there, Matt, as well. So just in terms of the comparisons with EIE data to sort of other data sets, prior to this sort of year, we hadn't had state totals for EIE data. So with EIE data, it's only available for certain municipalities, mostly inner city municipalities within each state. So we didn't have that overall state picture. Whereas, this year we were able to get that information from Google, which means we were able to compare this data to other data sets like, AGIS or Vic Roads data and stuff. And I guess one of the things it sort of showed was that the on-road data that we had from EIE was just limited to passenger vehicles. So that's why we've made that additional adjustment for on-road freight now as well. And we've also, we're able to compare the trips data to Vic Roads in terms of public transport, so bus, rail and tram, and it lined up really, really well for both rail and tram, but there were some differences around bus. And interestingly, we're having some discussions with Google now around trying to work out I guess improving methodologies around sort of bus data as well. But I guess just having this really granular data at the LGA level compared to other data sets which are more at the state level is incredibly valuable. But there's certainly been a lot of work done comparing this data to other data sets to see how it compares around completeness and those sort of things.
Mitch, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I was just hoping we could unpack the IPPU data and just kind of neglecting refrigerants for a bit. The industrial processes, is that you guys pretty much just take any companies that are captured under the safeguard mechanism within any LGA and kind of figure it out based on that? Or is there more data that goes into it? And I kind of just saw that question, the pre-asked question about the IPPU and how it's decoupled from electricity. The safeguard mechanisms, and I don't know specifically how this works, but it says it just reports on scope one emissions. So does that not include their electricity consumption? And then I guess you guys wouldn't need to decouple that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you want me to go with this, Rich? Or
Go for it. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so we have 3 data sets that we draw from for looking to information